potential of the second language classroom. We often hear that you have to live in the country in order to achieve any real proficiency in a second language. In order for us to be proficient in second language, they said we should live in the country who are using second language as their first language or the native speaker. And that the informal real-world environment is always superior to the classroom or the formal environment. The classroom has limitation than the informal environment or the outside world. The real advantage of the informal environment is that it supplies comprehensible input. The informal environment gives more input because there are more people who use second language for communication. The informal environment is not always willing to supply comprehensible input to the older second language student. This is simply a reflection of the fact that the adult world is more complex than the world of the child, and our expectations for adult comprehension are much higher. Not all informal environment will supply comprehensible input, especially for the adult learner, because adult learner is more complex and got higher comprehension than a child. Adult learner can learn whether inside the classroom or outside the classroom. In case of the adult beginner, the classroom can do much better than the informal environment. For the beginner, the classroom is the first step where they can learn what they want to learn. The second language classroom, we have the potential of supplying full 40 to 50 minutes per day of comprehensible input that will encourage language acquisition. The value of the second language classes, then, lies not only in the grammar instruction, but in the simpler teacher talk, the comprehensible input. The teacher simply gives information to the student in a natural way by talking. The teacher will help them to emphasize their vocabulary. It can be an efficient place to achieve at least the intermediate levels rapidly, as long as the focus of the class is on providing input for acquisition. As long as you're focused in class, you can learn, because providing input is like you're feeding them information. The more you feed them information, the more they can learn. Limitations of the classroom. First, it is very clear that the outside world can supply more input. When we say input, it refers to the processable language the learners are exposed to while listening or reading. Outside world has no limitation than inside the classroom. The informal environment will therefore be of more and more use as the acquirer progresses and can understand more and more. Second, as many scholars have pointed out, the range of discourse that the student can be exposed to in second language classroom is quite limited, no matter how natural we make it. The classroom setup is different from outside setup, because you can only acquire or learn inside the classroom but limited. When you're outside the classroom, you can acquire more because you are more exposed to people who are using second language as their language. Its goal is not to substitute for the outside world, but to bring students to the point where they can begin to use the outside world for further acquisition. The classroom will also help the student to learn and to practice using second language for acquisition. Yes, you can learn inside the classroom, but limited. Two ways where they can begin to understand the language used on the outside. First is by supplying input so that the student progress in language acquisition, so that they can understand real language to at least some extent. As what I've said earlier, input is a processable language the learner is exposed to while listening or reading, or the receptive skills. When we say receptive skills, it involves receiving information. The more you feed them information, the more they will understand. Second is by making the student conversationally competent, that is, by giving the student tools to manage conversations despite a less than perfect competence in the second language. In this situation, the teacher can give us activity where we can use our second language as a tool to manage conversation. For example, the extemporaneous talking or the impromptu. In this activity, we can use our second language as a tool. The role of output. The input hypothesis makes a claim that may seem quite remarkable to some people. We acquire spoken fluency not by practicing talking, but by understanding input, by listening and reading. Through listening, we can acquire, and through reading, we can learn. If you both read and listen, you can understand, and when you understand, you can speak. As what I have observed, the person who reads a lot is good in speaking English because reading is a brain exercise. Output has contribution to make a language acquisition, but it is not a direct one. Simply, the more you talk, the more people will talk to you. When we say output, it is a language produced by speaking and writing, or the productive skills. A second language speaker who makes a lot of mistakes, has a poor accent, and is hesitant will mostly likely receive, in general, more modified input than a speaker who appears competent and fluent. We, as a second language speaker, we tend to make a lot of mistakes and poor accent. Due to our poor accent, people who think they are good in speaking our second language tend to make fun of us. Engaging in conversation is probably much more effective than eavesdropping for language acquisition. Eavesdropping means you are secretly listening to something private. Why don't you engage conversation if you want information? Eavesdropping is not really good. In conversation, the second language acquirer has some degree of control of the topic, can signal to the partner that there is comprehension problem. There is no such control in eavesdropping, but in order to participate conversation, there must be at least some talk, some output from each partner. In conversation, there must be speaker and there must be a listener. Conversation and language acquisition. Some scholars have suggested that participation in conversation is responsible for language acquisition. Contribution output can make the language acquisition. This figure shows how output contributes to language acquisition indirectly. Comprehensible input is responsible for progress in language acquisition. Output is possible as a result of acquired competence. When performers speak, they encourage input or people speak to them. And that is conversation. Output and learning. When a second language user speaks or writes, he or she may make an error. As a second language user, we can't avoid to make an error. When this error is corrected, these supposedly help the learner change his or her conscious mental representation of the rule or alter the environment of rule application. This is not to say that error correction is totally useless and that learning is of no value. Learning has a role to play, and error correction may be used in a certain situation. We, as the second language speaker, we tend to make mistakes, especially on how we pronounce words. The native speaker won't laugh at us. The one who laughs at us is the person who thinks they are good enough in speaking our second language.